It's funny how the quietest mornings usually precede the loudest days, the kind of stillness that feels heavy, almost expectant, like the world is holding its breath before screaming. I warned them. I gave them every opportunity to turn those tires around and go back to their manicured lawns and their geometric hedges, but they didn't listen, because people who think they own the world never listen to the man standing on the dirt they're trying to steal. It was barely dawn on a Saturday. The sun was just cresting over the Blue Ridge foothills, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, and I was out in the barn with Luna, my quarter horse, tossing fresh hay and listening to the rhythmic chewing that usually centers my soul, when I heard it. The sound that makes every hair on the back of a veteran's neck stand up, tires crunching on gravel where no tires should be. My property, Shadow Creek Ranch, sits on 80 acres of hard-fought, paid-for silence in Clearwater County, protected by a half-mile driveway, a steel gate, and signs that aren't asking for permission but stating a fact. No trespassing, private property, keep out. But as I stepped out of the barn, pitchfork still in hand, wiping the dust from my jeans, I saw it, a glossy black luxury SUV, entirely out of place against the rustic backdrop of my timberline, rolling past my gate like the driver couldn't read or just didn't care, sliding down the gravel with the entitlement of a conquering army. It didn't have plates on the front. The windows were tinted that illegal shade of "I'm important." And as it rolled to a stop right at the edge of my working pasture, I felt that cold, familiar switch flip in my chest, the one that turns off the rancher and turns on the soldier, the training from Camp Lejeune flooding back into my veins not as anger, but as absolute, crystalline clarity. I stood there, watching, waiting, letting them make the first move, because on your own land, patience is a weapon, and when the doors opened, it wasn't law enforcement that stepped out. It wasn't a lost tourist looking for directions. It was a finely dressed demolition crew. 3 men, built like vending machines with legs, wearing matching navy polos with a gold crest I didn't recognize, stepped out in a coordinated formation that screamed intimidation tactic, followed by a woman who looked like she had just marched out of a boardroom in hell. This was Patricia Vance, though I didn't know her name yet. A woman with a haircut sharp enough to cut glass and a tailored blazer that cost more than my truck, holding a tablet like it was the 10 Commandments, and she was God herself. "Good morning," she called out, her voice dripping with that fake, sugary politeness that usually hides a dagger. "You must be Mr. Thorne." And she started walking across my dirt in heels that were sinking into the soil, completely oblivious to the absurdity of her presence. I didn't move, didn't smile, just leaned on the pitchfork and said, "That depends entirely on who's asking and why you drove past 3 signs telling you to turn around." She didn't miss a beat, didn't even flinch, just smiled that tight, reptilian smile, and said, "I'm Patricia Vance, Director of Compliance for Oak Ridge Estates, and we're here to conduct a mandatory exterior assessment of your perimeter structures regarding the new phase for expansion visuals." Oak Ridge Estates was the suburban cancer spreading up the valley, a sprawling grid of beige boxes and homeowners associations that dictated everything from mailbox height to the species of petunias you could plant. But my land, my 80 acres, was miles outside their jurisdiction, a fact I stated clearly. "Ma'am, look around you. This is Shadow Creek, not Oak Ridge. You have no authority here, no jurisdiction, and you are currently trespassing on private land." She laughed, a short, dismissive sound, and tapped her tablet. "Actually, under the new Visual Harmony Buffer Zone initiative, any property bordering our future development is subject to aesthetic compliance reviews to ensure property values aren't negatively impacted by unsightly agricultural debris." And she gestured vaguely at my barn, my life's work, like it was a pile of trash. The biggest of the 3 goons, a guy with a neck thick enough to stop a shovel, took a step forward, crossing the invisible line between conversation and threat, scanning my property like he was casing a joint, while another one started filming with his phone, zooming in on my porch, my equipment, violating my privacy with every pixel he captured. "We have 2 options," Patricia continued, acting like she was negotiating a merger rather than invading a home. "Option A, you sign the voluntary compliance waiver granting us easement access for landscaping updates. Or Option B, we document these code violations, and I see several already, and we petition the county for blight removal and structural demolition." That was it. The mask was off. This wasn't an inspection. This was a shakedown, a coordinated pressure campaign designed to bully me into handing over control of my land so they could turn my treeline into a backdrop for their overpriced condos. I dropped the pitchfork, the metal clanging against a rock, and the sound made Luna whinny nervously in the barn, which drew the attention of the third thug, who started walking toward the stable door, reaching for the latch. "Don't touch that gate," I said, my voice dropping an octave, losing all the polite veneer. "You have 5 seconds to get back in that vehicle and leave. We are authorized personnel." Patricia shrieked, losing her cool for the first time. "Proceed with the inspection, gentlemen." And that one word, proceed, was the match in the powder keg. The big guy lunged at me, thinking his bulk was enough to intimidate an old man, not realizing that while he was lifting weights in a gym, I had been learning leverage in the mud of foreign countries. He reached for my collar, and I didn't think. I just flowed, stepping inside his guard, trapping his wrist, and using his own forward momentum to introduce his face to the gravel, dropping him hard enough to knock the wind out of the entire county. The second guy, the one filming on the porch, dropped his phone and rushed me, swinging wild, sloppy haymakers, so I ducked under a right hook and swept his leg, sending him crashing into the porch railing with a sickening crack of timber and bone. The third man, the one by the barn, froze, his hand hovering over the latch, seeing his 2 buddies groaning in the dirt, realizing that the narrative had changed violently and instantly. "You're assaulting my staff," Patricia screamed, backing up, her tablet shaking in her hands. "You're going to jail, you maniac." I ignored her, turning to the cabinet on my porch where I kept the tools for predator control, and I pulled out my 12-gauge pump action, the woodstock worn smooth by years of use, and I didn't point it at them. I pointed it at the sky, but the sound of that pump racking back and forth, chchk, is a universal language that cuts through every barrier of language and culture. The silence that followed was absolute. The birds stopped singing, the wind stopped blowing, and even the groans from the men on the ground ceased as they stared down the barrel of consequences they hadn't anticipated. "This is your final warning," I said, holding the line, standing between my home and their greed. "Get off my land, or I will treat you exactly like the predators you are." Patricia was hyperventilating, the color drained from her face, realizing her corporate authority meant absolutely nothing out here where the law is written in dirt and defended with steel. She scrambled back to the SUV, her men limping and crawling after her, dragging their bruised egos into the leather seats, tires spinning, throwing gravel as they peeled out of there like the devil himself was snapping at their heels. But as the dust settled and the adrenaline began to bleed out of my trembling hands, leaving me standing there with my shotgun and my racing heart, I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the opening shot of a war they had started, but one I was absolutely going to finish. The dust from their retreat hadn't even fully settled back onto the driveway before I was on the phone with the Clearwater County Sheriff's Office. Because if there's one thing you learn quickly, it's that the first person to call the cops controls the narrative, at least initially. Deputy Miller arrived 20 minutes later, a good man I'd known for years, followed by another cruiser, and by then, Patricia Vance had apparently found her courage at the bottom of a mimosa glass because she had looped back around and was waiting at the county road, screaming about assault, brandishing, and attempted murder. When Miller walked up my driveway, tipping his hat, he looked at the security footage I had queued up on my phone. The gate cam showing them passing the signs, the porch cam showing the big guy lunging at me, and the clear audio of me giving them every chance to leave. And he just shook his head, looking back at Patricia, who was practically vibrating with rage by her SUV. "She says you attacked them unprovoked," Miller said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "But this video says they trespassed, attempted entry, and initiated physical contact." So he went down there and told her in no uncertain terms that if she didn't vanish, she'd be the one leaving in handcuffs for criminal trespass, which sent her fleeing again, but not before she screamed something about destroying me in court. And sure enough, the silence lasted exactly 3 days before the real weapon arrived. A thick, heavy envelope delivered by a process server, stamped with the logo of Sterling and Holt, the most expensive law firm in the state, containing a lawsuit so thick it could choke a horse. They were suing me for everything: assault, battery, emotional distress, interference with commerce, and creating a visual nuisance. But the kicker, the absolute terrifying part, was a document claiming my land was actually subject to a dormant easement clause from 1985 that Oak Ridge Estates had supposedly reactivated. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the paperwork that threatened to take the only thing I loved, and I felt a cold knot of dread, because I can fight men, I can fight weather, I can fight predators, but I cannot fight $1 million in legal fees. That's when I called Sarah Jenkins, an old friend from the service who traded her combat boots for high heels and became a shark in the courtroom, a woman who hates bullies more than I do. Sarah flew in the next day, took one look at their filing, and laughed, a dry, sharp sound. They're trying to bury you in paper, Elias. They want you to run out of money before we even get to discovery. But then she started digging, pulling zoning maps, county records, and original surveyor plots from the basement of the courthouse. For 2 weeks, we lived in a sea of documents, drinking stale coffee and looking for the needle in the haystack, until one night, around 2 a.m., Sarah slammed her hand on the table so hard my mug jumped. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing to a digital map overlay that Oak Ridge had submitted to the Planning Commission versus the original geological survey from the 70s, the boundary line. It moved. It wasn't just a mistake. It was fraud, deliberate, and clumsy. Someone had digitally altered the floodplain map to extend their visual harmony zone onto my property, likely because they had pre-sold units with guaranteed unobstructed views that my barn was currently obstructing. But before we could even file our countermotion, the war shifted to a new front, the internet, because Patricia, in her infinite arrogance, had posted a sob story on the neighborhood Facebook group, claiming a violent squatter had attacked her peaceful inspection team, trying to rally the community to pressure the sheriff to arrest me. It backfired spectacularly because I hadn't just given the footage to the police. I had sent the raw, unedited clip of the confrontation to a few veteran buddies, who sent it to a few ranching forums, and within 48 hours, the video titled, "HOA Thugs Get Lessons in Gravity," had millions of views. The comments weren't supporting Oak Ridge. They were cheering for the guy defending his home, dissecting Patricia's entitlement, and mocking the tactical gear of her goons, turning the public opinion tide so violently that the HOA shut down their comments section. And then came the knock on the door that changed everything. Not a process server, not a cop, but a battered pickup truck rolling up the drive, driven by the tall guy I had swept on the porch, the one whose leg I had hurt. His name was Caleb, and he looked like a man who hadn't slept in a week, holding a manila folder like it was a bomb, standing on my porch with his hat in his hands. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking. "She told us you were a squatter, that the land was legally theirs and you were refusing to leave. I didn't know it was your home, sir." I could have chased him off, could have let the anger win, but I saw the shame in his eyes, so I listened as he told me that Patricia was planning to hang them out to dry, blaming the rogue actions of her security team to save her own skin. Caleb handed me the folder, and inside were printouts of emails, text messages, and internal memos from Patricia Vance explicitly ordering them to provoke a reaction, to make him afraid, and acknowledging that they didn't have the permits, but would fix it later. It was the smoking gun, the nuclear launch codes, and the key to my salvation, all wrapped up in the conscience of a man who realized he was on the wrong side of history. The courtroom in Clearwater County smells like floor wax and old decisions, a heavy, somber atmosphere that usually makes people whisper, but on the day of our hearing, the air was electric, buzzing with the kind of tension you get right before a lightning strike. Patricia Vance sat at the plaintiff's table, looking diminished, her hair slightly less perfect, her suit slightly less sharp, flanked by 3 lawyers who looked expensive but nervous, while I sat with Sarah, just the 2 of us, armed with a flash drive and the absolute certainty of the truth. Judge Holloway, a man with a face carved out of granite and a reputation for having zero tolerance for nonsense, took the bench, peering over his glasses at the circus Oak Ridge Estates had brought into his chambers. Their lead attorney stood up, smoothing his silk tie, and launched into a prepared speech about community standards, progress, and my violent, unprovoked assault on innocent inspectors, painting me as a deranged hermit standing in the way of civilization. He spoke for 20 minutes, using big words to hide small lies, and when he finished, Patricia looked smug, thinking her money had bought her the narrative. thinking the game was played on paper and she had the most ink. Then it was Sarah's turn, and she didn't give a speech. She simply stood up, plugged her laptop into the court's projection system, and said, "Your Honor, the defense moves to dismiss all charges and countersues for fraud, malicious prosecution, and conspiracy, and we offer the following evidence, Exhibit A." She played the video first, not the edited clip Patricia had tried to leak, but the full, high-definition audio and video from my security system, showing the trespassing, the clear warnings, Patricia's scream to proceed, and the aggression of her men. The courtroom went silent, the only sound the aggressive scratching of the court reporter's machine, but Sarah didn't stop there. "Exhibit B," she announced, projecting the internal emails Caleb had provided, the ones where Patricia wrote, "He's just an old man. Scare him off. Use force if necessary. I'll handle the sheriff." You could actually hear the gasp in the gallery, the sound of the air being sucked out of the room, as Judge Holloway's face turned a dark, terrifying shade of red. He looked at Patricia, who was now shrinking into her chair, realizing that her shield of corporate anonymity had just been shattered into a million pieces. Exhibit C. Sarah delivered the final blow, bringing up the overlay of the map, flashing back and forth between the real county survey and the forged document Oak Ridge had submitted. "This is not a buffer zone dispute, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice cutting like a razor. "This is attempted theft of real property through forgery and intimidation." Judge Holloway didn't even let their lawyers rebut. He slammed his gavel down so hard it sounded like a gunshot. "In 30 years on the bench," he rumbled, his voice shaking the walls, "I have never seen such a flagrant abuse of the legal system, such a disgusting display of arrogance, and such a criminal disregard for property rights." He looked directly at Patricia Vance, and for the first time, she looked small, just a scared person who had forgotten that rules apply to her too. "Case dismissed with prejudice," the judge roared, "and I am referring this entire matter, specifically the actions of Ms. Vance, to the district attorney's office for immediate criminal investigation regarding fraud and solicitation of assault." The relief didn't hit me all at once. It washed over me slowly, like rain after a drought, as I watched Patricia trying to argue with her lawyers, who were already packing their briefcases, distancing themselves from the sinking ship. She lost her job 2 days later. The HOA board fired her in a panic to avoid liability, and within 6 months, Oak Ridge Estates was under state investigation, their expansion halted, their reputation in tatters. Caleb, the guy who turned whistleblower, actually came by the ranch a month later to help me fix a fence line, working for free to work off his guilt, and he turned out to be a decent kid who just got caught up in the wrong crowd. But the real closure came yesterday, when I stood at the end of my driveway with Old Man Rivers, a local welder, watching him bolt a new sign onto the steel posts of my gate. It wasn't angry, it wasn't a warning, it was just a statement. Shadow Creek Ranch, EST 1998, forever free. As I watched the sun go down over the valley, painting the sky the same purple and gold as that morning the SUV arrived, I realized that while the court gave me justice, the land gave me peace. And that's the story, short, sharp, and dramatic, just like the shotgun pump that started it all. But it leaves you with a question that keeps me up at night, looking at the lights of the city creeping closer every year. When the law fails to protect the sanctity of your home, and money tries to rewrite the map, at what point does a good man stop being polite and start being dangerous? Because they called me violent for defending my doorstep, but I ask you, who were the real aggressors? The man with the shotgun standing on his own porch, or the woman with the tablet trying to steal the ground beneath his feet? You tell me.